So I had great intentions this morning. I sent out an email with an article. I mentioned an article from the Atlantic in it that I wanted to talk about tonight. And I got an email and a text tonight about 5 o'clock. There is no link connected to there is no link in the email, which lead me to two things. I thought, oh, rats, I forgot to put the link in. And then I thought, how come nobody noticed till 5 o'clock? But that's neither here nor there. We'll press forward. I did send another message. I don't know if you had a chance to look at it or not. If you didn't, that's okay. We'll work around it. But I sent another message just this time with the article just attached. And if you read it, great. If you didn't, I won't take off from your final grade or anything. So this article that I read was called "Let It Be," and it's an old article from 2003, but I ran across it a couple of weeks ago, and there's a lot in it that I thought really was kind of relevant to some of the things we're talking about, and just wanted to sort of begin at least in talking about some of the points from the article. If you read it, what did you take away? If anybody wants to share that. The article is the sort of descriptive line at the top is: the greatest development in modern religion is not a religion at all. It's an attitude best described as apathyism. Apathyism, as in theology and apathy. So an apatheist is somebody who, in the terms of the article, doesn't really care. They just don't really care. He begins the article kind of relating a conversation that he had when someone asked him about his religion, and he said, "Atheist, I was about to say, but I stopped myself. I used to call myself an atheist," I said, "and I still don't believe in God, but the larger truth is it has been years since I really cared one way or another." And that was when it hit him. He says, "I'm an apatheist, a disinclination to care all that much about one's own religion, and an even stronger disinclination to care about other people's." So when I refer to this guy as apathetic about religion, I'm really not, and the way we hear that usually, it sounds like a value judgment. I'm not trying to make a value judgment. That's how the guy characterizes himself. I don't really care. It doesn't really matter to me. Now, I don't know, for me, that was kind of a revelation. I grew up in church, right? I grew up caring about religion. Now, there have been times in my life when I cared more than other times. That's true. So maybe I can relate a little bit to that perspective, and maybe you can too. Maybe there have been times in your life when you were more or less interested in religion, faith, whatever. But it is hard for me to relate to even those times where maybe personally I was going through a time when it didn't, I didn't really care that much. I wasn't that invested. If somebody said, I don't care about God, I don't believe in God, I would probably have responded with some shock and some having a hard time believing that and understanding that, because to me that's a big deal. That question of God and how we worship him and how we serve him is kind of huge. But this guy just kind of owns up to the fact that I don't really care. And not only does he not care, he thinks that's a really good thing. And he thinks the rise, what he sees in this article, the argument he makes is that attitude about religion is on the rise in America. Again, this is 2003. It's a long time ago. But he said that that attitude is on the rise in America. And he thinks that's a very good thing. Why do you think he feels like that's a good thing? Try to put yourself in his shoes for a minute. Why would that be a good thing? Doesn't religion make the world better?
I think what
Well, it supports his thinking.
What's that?
It supports his thinking.
Well, sports is thinking. Yeah, that's that. You know, it's always nice to sort of, you know, feel like you're right. Yeah. What else might be? Josh, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I religion has become a point of divisiveness and political discord in our culture. And I would argue that, and I think the author of this article would argue that, full disclosure, I just read it sitting here right now, but I think the author of this article would argue that religious people and non-religious people are equally to blame for that with how they've approached the other side. And I think he sees apathy towards religion as a balm to that and a way to diffuse those conflicts.
It is not a new idea, really. And the guy kind of acknowledges that in this article. It's not really a new idea. The notion of that and in some look back at our own country, right? What's one of the foundational freedoms in the Bill of Rights?
First Amendment, the first freedom mentioned is religion.
Meaning, we don't want a rehash of all the religious wars that Europe has fought over the last, you know, however long. So we're going to do something different. That's, in a sense, kind of a callback to this notion that religion, while it has benefits, it has also in the world created conflicts. Now, I think all of us would probably argue that, well, it's the misapplication of religion, it's the misuse of religion, whatever. Granted, and I would agree with that. But from this perspective, it's you know, it's better to just be able to say it doesn't really matter to me that much. I'm not a believer, but I'm fine if you are. He makes the point that how does he put it? Let's see. Let me find it. The hot-blooded atheist cares as much about religion as does the evangelical Christian, but in the opposite direction. I mean, that's often true, right? That there's this sort of, you know, there's a brand of atheism that says, you know, I don't believe and I don't want you to either, and so can be awfully passionate about non-belief, almost as passionate, perhaps as passionate as we are about belief. His point being, when you don't care, there's a lot of freedom.
We've already run into a stupid assumption. Why should we avoid conflict?
What's that? What's that now?
We're supposed to assume that that's good. Why?
I'm sorry. Somebody, I think, is that Matt?
The
You're kind of
voice
breaking
coming
up.
from Alan's picture, but
Yeah,
Alan not talking. So it sounded like Matt.
I think it's Matt, but he kind of broke up on me. I didn't quite catch it.
Yeah, that was me. I'll get closer to the mic. We're already facing an interesting assumption, which is that we should avoid conflict. Why should we
Okay.
avoid conflict?
I think the conflict he's talking about, particularly in the article, is conflict that ends with, you know, planes crashing into buildings. This was 2003 when he wrote
Right.
the article.
That's what's on his mind. Yeah, he uses the zealotry of the Middle East as an example of what to avoid. But that's the thing. If you say religion's not worth caring about, then why should we make all these other assumptions about what makes a good life versus a bad one?
Okay, so
That starts to break down, not for him.
let's back up. Let's take a step back just a minute, because the question I asked was, why do you think he believes this? I'm asking us to sort of put ourselves in his shoes. Why do you
Well,
think he believes this?
I think we've identified that. He thinks that everyone's going to be better off if religion is just a private thing and we interact on others. So he doesn't have a problem with you believing in Christianity or Judaism or Islam, as long as it's just your personal issue, your personal belief, and you don't really try to convey it to other people or think that. So in many respects, his attack is specifically on evangelism or evangelicalism, no matter in what form you have it, whether it's Islamic or Buddhist, or he thinks that kind of outreach or bringing religion into things and confronting people and seeking to share brings on confrontation. And he just assumed that everyone does this sort of with the door shut and you're free to then do whatever you want. But once the door is open, you don't do it. And why it troubled you was because you were brought up in an evangelical household where that's sort of the be all and end all. I would suggest, I would question your citing of the First Amendment. That's a little more complicated. That only applied to the federal government and a few other things there. But whenever the term evangelicalism arose in American religion, I would suggest that is a sign that there was at least a perception that many Christian churches in the United States weren't really all that interested anymore in evangelism. They were moving on down this path that we're just going to deal with our members and who comes to us voluntarily, but we're not going to have a focus on spreading the gospel, especially to our neighbors and friends and the like. Now, whether I could question whether that perception was accurate, but at least at that point, there was a perception that some Christian churches were moving away from a bedrock importance of evangelism. So anti-evangelical or something like that. And that would apply also with respect to Islam and all those other, he wouldn't have a problem with you being Muslim, as long as you're not going to try to foist your Muslim views on other people and the like. And he thinks things are going to be peaceable that way. But Christ said, I bring a sword, right? I mean, Christ even said, it is true that the gospel message does sometimes result in a negative reaction. That seems to have been an inherent part of Christianity from the beginning. So I'm not sure that evangelicals have it all that wrong when we say that, and being contrary to this view is sort of or adopting this view would sort of be the death knell of Christianity as Christ envisioned it.
There are a couple of ways I want to kind of go with this. But I started here, let's get in his shoes for a minute, because I think this might be pretty important in understanding some things about why people sometimes walk away from church, even people who grew up in it, why they might sometimes walk away. And I think that this idea really has taken hold in our culture and in our society. And I think it makes it, it's not necessarily just that people don't care about church, it's that they don't really care much about religion. And they may not be particularly hostile, but it just doesn't matter to them very much in the way they live their lives.
Patrick?
Yeah.
I had a problem with the term apathyism or whatever he calls it, because I don't actually think it's one or the other. I don't actually think that it's apathy to say everyone is walking down a path and I can be respectful of that path and still believe very strongly in my own religious views. I don't, so I had a little problem with just the whole idea of it being apathy. But I also, my dad said that, and when he started being a professor, people were very, there was a very like academic anti-religion vibe, not among everybody, but it was definitely strong. And now there's a lot more respect and willingness to value people whose religions were important to them, and different people had different approaches, and Christianity wasn't anti-academic. And he's noticed a big change over the decades. So I don't know that it's accurate. I'm sure there's a segment, but I don't know that I would agree with the idea that young adults don't care. I think the problem may be that we haven't done a real good job of showing them what the gospel is. I'm not sure that the message about a sword from Jesus meant a sword in the terms of the government, or that we have a right to fight each other about religion. I think it was more like the people in power may be threatened by our true gospel message. And so this is going to bring about surprising changes. I don't know. I'm not Jesus, but I'm not sure it's the automatic, well, it's okay to fight about our religion. I mean, Jesus he may have said that, but he didn't really do a lot of actual promoting fighting about what he was saying. It was actually the
That's
opposite.
exactly right.
So I think the gospel message is supposed to be so radical that it brings about power changes and people unwilling to go along with the folks in charge, and willing to be more generous than we expect, and all those things that we struggle with and we don't do as well as we should, myself included, that causes conflict in a different way than us arguing with each other about who's got the right religious idea. So I don't think we hang our hat on, it's okay for me to fight somebody because I know I'm right. And that's the thing I think that's putting people off. It's our arrogance about it in some format. We don't see it because we understand that we don't have it figured out, but we still portray that I personally think is and I think he's getting at it. I just don't think it's as simple as his article makes it.
So let me just a couple of things here. One, you did a great job of summarizing what we're going to talk about, which is great. And
They're a lot more empathetic than me.
And then, as far as his use of the term was a joke. The term was him making a joke. So I don't think he's saying young adults are apathetic. I think he's saying that young adults, about some of the things that are important to certainly young adults in his time, about some of the things that are important to religious people, to them, it doesn't make a big difference. It doesn't really matter that much. And they're fine talking about it and they're respectful of it, but it doesn't really make a big difference. I think it's easy, and this is the trap I kind of fell into. I've heard all my life, you can't be an apathetic Christian, you're going to be, which I think is true, but that's not really what he's getting at. He talks about people who are friends of his. He says, even true believing godliness today often has an apatheistic flavor. I have Christian friends who organize their lives around an intense and personal relationship with God, but who betray no sign of caring that I am an unrepentantly atheistic Jewish homosexual. Now, I would argue there are all kinds of reasons to explain the relationship that these Christian friends have with this person. And it may have nothing to do with whether they care or not. But I think that's the sort of the thing he's getting at, that I have these friends, I have these relationships with people, and the fact that they are dedicated Christians doesn't mean I can't have this friendship with them. And he values that and thinks that's very important.
But I would argue that is Christian.
Okay, I'm not. I wouldn't debate you on that. But
I would
that's
further argue that that may be a very Christian attitude. That is not an attitude that reflects the beliefs and stereotypes that people have about Christians. So when, ironically enough, when people see Christian-like behavior coming from a Christian, they see it as unchristian because they have all these other associations with Christianity that are the exact polar opposite of what they should be, if that makes any sense.
It does.
whatsoever.
It does. It does. I mean, some of the explanations I would have for their love of him and their care for him, that they respect and love him for who he is, that they are considerate of his status as a person who doesn't share their faith, that they understand that he didn't ask to be who he is, that they recognize that you can't ask somebody who doesn't follow Jesus to act like somebody who follows Jesus particularly. All sorts of reasons might be a part of this. And I think I think the very fact that he admires this brand of religion that he has coined, which, by the way, I think it's hilarious. I like the term. I think it's funny. But I think the fact that he admires this is, as Josh says it, in some ways demonstrative that he, and it's something you said too, Christy, it's that he has not seen, recognized, been exposed to the gospel of Christ. Only perhaps a caricature of it that has left him saying anything is preferable to that. Anything is preferable to this caricature that I've seen.
Yeah, the problem with it is, though, that he seems to have mistaken, at least I hope he is mistaken, his friends' respect for him and his beliefs and where he is. He seems to be equating that with the idea that his Christian friends don't care that he's not a Christian. And if they really are to a point where they don't care that somebody isn't a Christian, then I think that's an issue. I think as Christians, we're called to care that people aren't a Christian. And we've talked about, already mentioned, the thing he objects to is when we display that confrontationally or in certain ways, but hopefully they care. Christianity doesn't really admit, I don't think, and this is unfortunate, and I don't think we can get around it. Christianity doesn't really admit to a position, well, Christianity is right for me, but for other people, it's really up to them and what they think. Christianity doesn't do that.
Yeah.
Christianity says we're right, and we want to share that with other people.
But we allow people to get there in their own way, and
Well,
maybe over years.
We allow them to do that, but then you've got the song also, "You Never Mentioned Him to Me," right? Which is a little bit haunting when you think about the missed opportunities when you might have shared the gospel, and not just the rudiments that this person probably already knows, but maybe a personal sharing of what a relationship with Jesus has meant to you, or what it's inspired you to do, and things that would actually maybe get somebody to really think about it, not just in terms of the platitudes, but in terms of real depth. That I would hope they would care about that. Maybe I just hope they haven't really had an opportunity to do that.
Well, and as soon as he's told us, as soon as someone tries to tell him, that may be the end of that.
And it may be, and you know, and that's, you know, that's part of the struggle we have, and part of the struggle that believers have always had. You know, how do we share the gospel, which we believe is compelling and which we believe is for everyone? How do we share that in a way, especially in a culture in which, I think there's always been that struggle, right? Paul had trouble in Athens. I think there's always been that struggle with when belief systems clash, people get uncomfortable. And we would respond the same way. So, this article to me had some kind of important insights that maybe I don't always take seriously enough. And so I want to sort of talk about, how do we then respond to this? How do we respond to this? I just don't care. You're talking to a loved one, you're talking to a friend, you're talking to a young adult who's walked away from church, a teenager who's walked away from church, and you want to try to win them to the gospel, and you want to try to help them, grow in their faith, and you do it because you love them and you care about them. How do we respond to this sort of, it just doesn't matter to me that much?
This article sparked a lot of memories for me of high school, in college too, even though it was a Christian college. I was around young people, like we've been talking about these past several weeks, who were saying these exact same things about it. The thing I heard the most often, I think, was I just don't care about church and about religion. I care about the real world, and things that matter in my world today. Right. And I struggled to understand, because that was so diametrically opposed to my experience of religion. And I can't share that, but I can acknowledge that it seems like lots of young people are having the experience. We talked about it through the survey results, right? Yeah. That one of the main factors was a lack of relevance that some of these young people were saying was a reason they were leaving church. And where was I going with this? But the gospel properly realized is all about the real, quote, the real world, and how you live your life on earth. And if we're not teaching that, by and large, my experience has been that you're growing up at Northwest. I didn't have that experience at all. But if the church, by and large, is not teaching that, that's a big problem, I'd say. And I think a way to get people to care about religion, people who are on the members of the church who are on the fence, be they young, old, whatever, is to make it abundantly clear how the gospel applies to life, and specifically to their life. And that takes knowing their life, and that takes understanding what they're struggling with, and knowing what the gospel says about what that is.
I jotted some things down here, and one of the things I jotted down is, how do we respond to this? Well, being with people in the lives they're actually living, because I do think that sometimes we have communicated perhaps, listen, when I say we, I don't necessarily mean anybody here. I always want to leave this caveat because I know people, bridle when I say things like this. I don't necessarily mean anybody sitting here. But I do think, except for myself, I do think there have been times that I have communicated or failed to communicate the real world relevance of the gospel. I think there have been times that I have used language and said things in ways that make it seem that that the Bible is this odd book that has nothing to do with anybody, anybody's real life. And I feel that. I recognize that.
No one's apathetic about their own life.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right.
If you can make that connection between scripture and something they care about,
right,
suddenly it becomes of utmost importance.
And it comes back to some of the things we've talked about with community and being with people where they are and connecting with them where they are. And I think sometimes people who are, whether they're younger or older, people who are, just having trouble getting too concerned about faith at all, or religion at all, or church at all, is either they think that we don't have the same struggles they have and have no answers for them, or we do have the same struggles and still have no answers, but are pretending that's not true. And I think the third option ought to be, look, I see what you're dealing with. In some ways I can relate to it. In some ways, maybe I can't. Could you help me? Could you help me understand what you're dealing with and where you are? And then together, let's find those answers. Let's find where the gospel takes us together, and let's figure that out as we walk together.
We're oftentimes talking about the gospel, and I understand as what you believe, and so we're talking about doctrines and belief systems and all this type of stuff. People, I think throughout history, some people have been interested in that stuff. A lot of people are less interested in that stuff. Today, for many young people, or many old people, that's not what grabs them. But what does grab them sometimes is action. I am absolutely certain that I can get, I have a better likelihood of inviting somebody to help in our food pantry than I do to inviting them to service. And actually among the young people, at least if I go by my kids and their friends, a lot of young people are interested in doing things. And then once they get involved in the doing things, I'm not saying it's a come on or anything, but right, they're associating with you. There's an opportunity for conversation. They see Christianity isn't just about beliefs, deeds, words and not deeds kind of thing. They see the deeds, they're interested in the deeds. And then you mentioned another thing, community. There used to be really an idea, at least I saw glimmers of it, that the church was a community center, right? So churches used to sponsor Boy Scout troops and Girl Scout troops and provide space for Alcohol Anonymous meetings and offer themselves as community meeting spaces and the like that. Again, that's embedding yourself in the community instead of separating yourself, such that you get that flow of people in, and maybe that does lead to people saying, well, let me talk with you, and they buy into the fact of what the church, the deeds part, and the words they follow down the road.
I think that's exactly right. You mentioned service, and that or being active, and one of the things I jotted down was service. making an immediate difference. Sometimes it's hard to see, the difference that meditating on scripture or sitting in worship makes in your life. I think it makes a difference. I think it makes a difference in my life, and I think it makes a difference in the world around me. But sometimes it's harder to see that. It is, unquestionable. You hand somebody a bag of food, you've given them food. they can, they didn't have food and now they do. You give somebody a coat, you help somebody, fix a problem in their house or whatever it is. You've done this thing that's tangible. And I do think people relate to that. I think everybody relates to that better in some ways. And I think especially there's a drive as people are younger, there's a drive to let's make the world better. let's do something to improve tangibly the world around us. And if anything, that's only grown since I was a young adult, that desire.
Patrick,
Yeah.
you said what would be an approach, I think was one of your questions, to someone who doesn't see that the way they're treated with respect is actually connected to their religion as opposed to not. I think in interpersonal relations, this is a little different from the service part of it, but one of the things that I am finding more and more value in is the conversation of, well, this is how I see it, as opposed to, well, this is clearly the way it is. It doesn't mean we believe it less. It means that we're walking down our paths, as I mentioned before, and we're taking it seriously. We're not apathetic, but we're also not saying, I'm waiting for you to get in line behind me. We're saying, let's walk beside each other and I'll learn from you. It doesn't mean we don't care as much about it. It just means that we're willing to take that role. I find a very interesting concept that I hadn't really thought about until the last year or so, which is the idea of the gift of faith. That some people have the gift of faith and others struggle with the gift of faith, to be an interesting one, just because what it really informs me of is that it's not as easy for some people to make those steps as others, and that's to be respected as well. And I find it very helpful in terms of just being able to say, instead of saying, shaking you by the shoulders, why do you not see that Christianity is the right way to go? It's not as simple for some people as it may have been for some of us, maybe. Just
one of the things I think we've got to realize, we're all in some process spiritually, right? I mean, I don't think any of us are there yet. We're all in that process, and we have to trust that God is involved in that process too, and He wants us to be part of it, and He wants to use us in it. But it's as you say, it's something that we're not all in the same place, and we're not all going to be in the same place. And I think sometimes we have to have some patience with people, and just not even patience, just sort of maybe even a curiosity. Where are you in the process? Where do you find yourself right now? And let's start there. Just that sort of interest that I'm interested in where you stand here. Paul does some of that in some of his preaching, right? I again in Athens, it's so interesting. I'm walking around the city and I'm seeing all these idols. You're very religious people. It's kind of a shocking thing for a Jewish rabbi to say, right? You're very religious people. I was really impressed by that. Really, that captured my notice. You even have an altar to an unknown God. Wow, what an interesting theology you have. So now, and then Paul says, now let me, if you will, tell you, what I know about this God that you don't know about. He says that in Athens, in the Areopagus, where they do nothing except sit around and talk about the latest ideas. So he's in a great place to do that sort of thing, right? But he begins where they are and shares the gospel. He says in Romans 9, I become all things to all people, that I might by all means save some. I invested in people. I poured myself out into people. I changed so that I could connect with people around me. A couple of things that I also jotted down here that I want to just share. One thing I think is sometimes when we start talking about things like this, we immediately get defensive. We want to throw up the the barriers and the, oh no, hold on, not me, not us, not, we can't be defensive. When we meet somebody who is an apatheist, when somebody we love is an apatheist, defensiveness is not the response. We get defensive because it's something that matters deeply to us that to them doesn't seem to. And our first response is, my first response is to want to explain in 25 words or less why they're wrong to be so not caring about this. But it's not about me. It's not about me being comfortable. It's not about me scoring a point. I can win those arguments. I can. But I haven't really won, have I? I could win, I could win an argument with somebody, with a lot of people. I could win an argument about, there's no evidence for God. Or there's no evidence that these kinds of things you can win arguments about all day long, but you haven't won anything because they're not convinced. They're gonna just push it off. Okay, whatever, fine. I'm not gonna argue anymore. The other thing is that comes to mind in all this, and some of you have said it in some ways. What are we communicating zeal about? Zeal is an old-fashioned word that we don't use very much anymore, but enthusiasm. What are we communicating enthusiasm about? I said it weeks ago as we were talking about some of this stuff, and I'm going to reiterate it now. If we are boring people with the gospel, we're doing something wrong. Maybe what we're communicating isn't the gospel. Romans 12:11, Paul says, never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor. And it's easy to use verses like that to say, don't stop coming to church. And don't. What Paul says is, keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. That's what he wants them to have fervor about, enthusiasm about, serving the Lord. Maybe it's easy for me to communicate why I think people ought to come to church and be excited about that. Maybe it's sometimes easier for me to do that than it is for me to communicate enthusiasm for Jesus and the gospel. Sometimes maybe it's our particular doctrinal idiosyncrasies. Perhaps sometimes it's political positions that we've confused with faith. I don't know, but it's easy for us to communicate other things, and people see that and hear that and go, I don't care about that. Why would I care about that? So I think part of our calling is to, with love and with grace and with respect, communicate why we're excited about the gospel. Why we are excited about following Jesus, why that means so much to us.
Well, and I think the other thing that's important to acknowledge, if we're not excited about the gospel anymore for any number of reasons, acknowledge that, and be honest, and learn to come to terms with that and figure out how to get excited about it again.
Yep.
Because sometimes I wonder if, and I've seen this in my life, do we preach a boring gospel sometimes because we're a little bored of the gospel? Have we, are there cases when we've lost the fervor that we once had for God's word? And if that's the case, are we passing that on to people? I think it'd be hard not to pass that on to people around us if we were.
Yeah.
One of the differences between, we only have, the New Testament books, a few books of the Bible to tell us about early church, but one of the differences that I think is probably pretty critical is that was new back then. We have 2,000 years of explaining to do. And that ain't easy sometimes,
Boy, you have a few crusades and they never let you live it down, do they?
You don't even have to go back to the Crusades, but still, you know what I mean? Like we understand it, but yeah, anyway, it was new then. So they didn't have to explain the mistakes yet.
Yeah. So, and here's the thing, and this is something that somebody mentioned early on, and I'll be brief with this, but and I think this is part of this sort of boring people with the gospel, for lack of a better phrase. The temptation is to lower the bar. But I think that in these situations, that what we need to be doing is asking big. Jesus said things like, "Come and die, sell everything you have and give it to the poor and follow me, and let the dead bury the dead." He had the parable in Luke 14 about counting the cost. You better be clear what the cost of discipleship is. You better be clear what it means for you to follow me. And I think we can make mistakes a couple of ways. First of all, we can make it sound like we're telling people you got to invest yourself in being like me, and that's not it, for sure. And sometimes I think we give the impression that there's really not much ask at all. But Jesus asks big. And I think if we can sort of help people see, one of the things that struck me is following Jesus is tailor-made for people who are ready to jump in with both feet and are passionate about making the world better. Following Jesus is tailor-made for folks like that. They just need to see that that's what it is, and need to jump in. I grew up hearing, and one of the reasons that I came to faith is Jesus died for my sins, and he did, and I'm thankful for that. There are a lot of people. This guy that wrote the article, that's not really high on his list of things to be concerned about. Now, I think as for Christians, we get to that point where we recognize that if we're going to follow Jesus, things have to change in our lives, and there's things we need to repent of and things we need to turn away from. But I don't think we start people off there if they're not there already. And I think there's lots of ways the gospel the story of Jesus can capture people. And biblically, there are all kinds of ways that the story of Jesus captures people before we get to, repent of your sins and I think maybe sometimes we're sort of stuck in it's a revivalistic model that kind of rose early in the last century of this is how we get people to faith. We get them onto the mourner's bench, we get them feeling guilty, and then we show them the gospel. And I'm not sure that's where that's how we're going to win people to faith or win them back to faith.
Patrick,
Yeah.
so an example, I was an adult before I really, and I went to church all my life. I was an adult before I really realized how radical Jesus talking to the Samaritan woman was. I mean, truly radical. I knew the story. I knew what he had said. I knew it was very impressive, but I didn't really get the context.
Yeah.
It's so powerful on so many levels. And that's just one example of how, I don't mean in a political way necessarily, although it could be that, but I think getting to some of those discussions, and maybe it's just I was in the wrong church or something, but I think that sometimes we get so used to our stories that we may grab people by getting into the context of it in ways that we're not necessarily always doing. And maybe that's just my experience. I don't know if other people have had that experience, but I think it's so powerful.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it turns things upside down, and that's the point of the gospel. It changes stuff around. It transforms. It disrupts. It's a disruptive force, and we sometimes perhaps haven't made that as clear as we should. One other thing, and then I got to stop. When we have young people in our church, when we have people who they haven't walked away, they haven't left, they haven't gone other places, they haven't given into this sort of apathyism that maybe some of their friends have. We've got to help them to use their gifts and their talents in the church, even if it is disruptive, even if it makes us have to rethink how we do things and change how we do things. And that can be hard, but the church is the only institution in the lives of young adults, I think, that says, sit quietly for a decade or two until we, entrust you with some real responsibility and some real stuff. And I just think that's wrong. It's just flat out wrong.
I'm going to disagree with you slightly there. Having just gone through the experience of being a young adult, I guess I'm still in that experience technically. It's not that the church is the only institution in which you're told to sit still and be quiet. It's that every single institution expects you to sit still and be quiet until you learn enough to do things right. And if the church isn't any different from that, why would we want to be any part of it? I mean,
Fair enough.
All those other institutions, school, work, that's not voluntary. Church is voluntary.
Fair enough. Companies are learning.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
We've got to leverage. We got to leverage the talents that these young adults are bringing to us. There's stuff they need to learn, but that doesn't mean they can't be changing things and making a difference in our organization. I'm speaking for myself. I'm sometimes reluctant I've been sometimes reluctant to entrust things, and we've got to let go of that. It's not our church. It doesn't belong to us. If somebody goofs up on something, we'll get through it. We'll manage it. The Lord will survive, and Christianity will survive, and we'll get on with things. Let them be experts in the things they're experts in. I'm grateful for Josh and for Peyton and for Mike and for Matt and for the people that are doing this live streams that so well that I couldn't I don't think I could do it. But I certainly couldn't do it as well as they are. People can be trusted with these things, and I think part of why some people, young adults, have left our church and other churches is they haven't been trusted, and they haven't been entrusted, and they have become frustrated by that. And I bear a lot of responsibility for that. So I got one other thing to talk about next week on this. If you've got some stuff you want to talk about, bring it next week, and then I'm going to move on. But I want some of this to just, I hope it sort of we sit with it, and we talk about it, and some change I hope will come of some of this. I don't want it to just be something we've talked about on Wednesday nights and we just leave. And for my part, I'm working on how we change some things so that we don't watch people walk away, and we perhaps become a place where a church where people who have sort of drifted off can find their way back to Jesus, and I'd like that very much. So I want to sort of round some things off next week, but if you have some things you want to talk about too, please bring them in, and we'll talk about it. Yeah, that's what I got. Appreciate everybody's thoughts and comments. Good to see everybody too.
Nice to see you too.
Have a good week, and we'll see
You
you soon.
too.
Everybody stay healthy. Bye, Jane.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good lesson.
Have a great
Good night, everybody.
Bye. Good night.
night.
Right.
Good night.
Christine. Hi, Linda.
Bye.
Guys
Good
have a good
night,
week.
Pat. Laura, John, Josh.
Bye.